In 1952, a convoy of 43 logging trucks left the forests of Oregon and never came back. The drivers were told they'd be hauling timber like they always had. But when they arrived at their new work site, there wasn't a single tree in sight, just endless stretches of desert. The machines that had clear-cut the Pacific Northwest for 3 decades were being retooled for a different kind of extraction. And the product wasn't lumber. It was sand. Most people think sand mining is some modern phenomenon driven by concrete demand and glass production. But the industrial sand trade began the exact same year the US timber industry hit peak harvest, 1952. Same machines, same operators, same corporate owners. The only thing that changed was the resource. However, this wasn't a coincidence. It was a calculated pivot by an industry that saw the writing on the wall. The trees were running out, but the machinery was just getting started. If you're into this kind of content, hit subscribe. I cover the economic pivots nobody talks about every week. The story starts in 1947, 5 years before those logging trucks rolled into the desert. The US Forest Service released an internal report that never made it to the public. It was called the reappraisal of the forest situation, and it contained one devastating conclusion. At the current rate of harvest, commercially viable old-growth timber in the continental United States would be functionally exhausted by 1965. 13 years, that's all the industry had left. The report sat on desks in Washington for 6 months before someone leaked a summary to a forestry trade journal. By then it didn't matter. The timber barons had already received advance copies through back channels. Companies like Weyerhaeuser, Georgia Pacific and Boise Cascade knew the math. They knew what was coming. But here's the thing. They'd spent decades building the most efficient extraction infrastructure in human history. Fleets of diesel-powered feller bunchers that could process 100 trees per hour. Hydraulic loaders with lift capacities exceeding 30 tons. Log skidders that could drag entire trees up mountainsides at grades steeper than 45 degrees. A single feller buncher cost approximately $80,000 in 1950. That's close to $1 million in today's money. Weyerhaeuser alone operated over 200 of these machines across the Pacific Northwest. Do the math and you're looking at a fleet worth $200 million in current value. And that's just one company, one type of machine. This wasn't equipment you could just write off, so they started looking for something else to extract. Something abundant, valuable and compatible with the same machinery. That's when they found sand. Not just any sand. Industrial silica sand. The kind used in glass-making, foundries, hydraulic fracturing and, most importantly, concrete. Post-war America was in the middle of the largest infrastructure boom in history. The interstate highway system was about to break ground. Suburban development was exploding across every major city. Every single project needed concrete, and concrete is 40% sand by volume. But there was a problem. Most people assume sand is everywhere, that it's essentially free for the taking. That's only partially true. The sand used for construction has to meet specific criteria. It needs to be angular, not rounded. Rounded sand from beaches or riverbeds doesn't lock together properly in concrete. It creates weak points, structural failures. What construction needs is silica sand that's been fractured by geological processes, creating sharp edges that interlock. The best deposits are found in ancient lake beds and desert basins, places where water once pooled millions of years ago, leaving behind layers of pure silica sediment. The American Southwest had exactly this. Geological surveys conducted in the late 1940s identified massive deposits in Nevada, Arizona and Southern California, running 50 feet deep and stretching for miles. A resource that wouldn't run out in their lifetimes, located in regions with virtually no environmental regulation. The demand was there. The question was whether the extraction process could be adapted. Turns out it could. A feller buncher designed to grab and cut a tree trunk worked just as well with a bucket attachment for scooping sand. A log skidder built to drag timber could be refitted to pull loaded hoppers across desert floors. Even the transportation infrastructure was identical. Logging roads became haul roads, timber railheads became sand terminals. By 1950, Weyerhaeuser had quietly purchased 73,000 acres of desert land in Nevada and California. The transactions were buried in subsidiary filings under names that had nothing to do with timber. Shell companies with names like Pacific Aggregate Holdings and Western Mineral Resources. Public records show the land cost an average of $4 per acre. In today's money, that's about $50 per acre for what would become some of the most valuable industrial sand deposits in North America. Then came the machinery conversion. Internal memos from Georgia Pacific, later leaked during an unrelated lawsuit in 1987, show the company spent $8 million between 1950 and 1952 retrofitting logging equipment for sand extraction. That's roughly $96 million in today's dollars. They weren't buying new machines. They were adapting the old ones. Hydraulic arms that once grabbed ponderosa pines now scooped silica. Blades designed to strip bark now leveled dunes. The workforce didn't change much either. Logging crews were told their operations were being relocated to new sites. Some were told the company was diversifying into aggregates. Others weren't told anything at all. They just showed up one day and found themselves staring at a desert instead of a forest. The pay was the same, the hours were the same, the danger was arguably worse. Sand is unforgiving. It gets into everything: lungs, engines, joints. Silicosis, a lung disease caused by inhaling crystalline silica dust, became the new version of the loggers' occupational hazards. The companies knew about silicosis. Medical literature from the 1930s had already documented the disease in miners and stonecutters. The symptoms are brutal: shortness of breath, persistent cough, chest pain, and eventually respiratory failure. There's no cure. Once the silica particles scar your lung tissue, the damage is permanent. Workers in the early sand operations weren't given respirators. They weren't warned about dust exposure limits. Some crews worked 12-hour shifts in conditions where visibility dropped below 10 feet because of airborne silica. By 1960, workers' compensation claims related to silicosis started appearing in Nevada and California. The companies fought them. They argued that silicosis was a pre-existing condition, that workers must have been exposed elsewhere. They tied up claims in legal battles that lasted years, long enough that some claimants died before seeing a settlement. But here's where it gets darker. The same regulatory gaps that let timber companies clear-cut public land without replanting applied to sand mining. There were no environmental impact studies, no restoration requirements, no limits on extraction volume. The companies walked into the desert with the same legal immunity they'd enjoyed in the forests. By 1955, 3 years after the first logging trucks arrived in Nevada, the US was producing 42 million tons of industrial sand annually. 10 years later, that number hit 98 million tons. The growth curve mirrored the collapse of old-growth timber harvests almost exactly. As one resource disappeared, the other surged. Now, you might be wondering why this story isn't common knowledge. Why isn't this taught in economics classes or covered in documentaries about American industry? The answer is that the companies involved actively worked to keep the connection hidden. Timber companies rebranded their sand operations under entirely separate corporate entities. Weyerhaeuser's sand division operated as Weyerhaeuser Real Estate Company for decades, making it look like property development rather than extraction. Georgia Pacific ran its sand mines through a subsidiary called a GP Harmon Glass, making it appear to be a glass manufacturing venture rather than mining. They even hired different PR firms. The messaging around timber had always been about heritage, craftsmanship, and the romance of the American frontier. Lumber companies sold themselves as stewards of the land. But sand mining had no cultural mythology to lean on, so the companies stayed quiet. They ran the operations with minimal publicity, filed the required permits under obscure regulatory codes, and let the public focus on the visible part of the concrete boom, the highways, the suburbs, the skyscrapers, without questioning where the raw materials actually came from. The environmental consequences didn't become visible until the 1970s, when satellite imagery made it possible to see the scale of desert disruption. Researchers at the USGS started comparing images from 1950 and 1975. What they found was staggering. Over 60,000 acres of previously stable desert had been converted into active or abandoned sand mines. The abandoned sites were especially troubling. With no replanting requirements and no economic incentive to restore the land, companies simply walked away when a site was depleted. But the damage went deeper than what satellites could see. Desert ecosystems are fragile in ways most people don't understand. The surface layer of many deserts is held together by biological soil crust, a living skin of cyanobacteria, lichens and mosses that takes decades to form. This crust prevents erosion, retains moisture, and provides nutrients for plant life. When you scrape it away with industrial equipment, you don't just remove sand, you destroy the entire ecological foundation. Studies conducted in the 1980s showed that disturbed desert sites lost up to 90% of their native plant species within 5 years of mining operations. Without the biological crust, wind erosion increased by a factor of 10. Dust storms became more frequent and more severe. Communities downwind of abandoned mines reported respiratory problems, damaged crops, and visibility hazards. One particularly bad dust storm in 1983, originating from a depleted sand mine in Nevada, reduced visibility on Interstate 15 to 0 and caused a multi-vehicle pileup that killed 4 people. Groundwater contamination became a serious issue. Sand mining operations require massive amounts of water for processing and dust suppression. In desert regions where water tables are already stressed, the withdrawals caused wells that had served nearby communities for generations to run dry. Then there's the carbon footprint. Moving sand is energy intensive. A single truckload of industrial sand weighs around 25 tons. Multiply that by millions of loads per year, factor in the fuel consumption of the machinery, and you're looking at an operation with a carbon output comparable to medium-sized industrial cities. Consider the logistics chain. Sand extracted in Nevada might be shipped to concrete plants in Los Angeles, a distance of 300 miles. A heavy haul truck getting 6 miles per gallon burns 50 gallons of diesel for that trip. At 22 pounds of carbon dioxide per gallon, that's 1,100 pounds of emissions per load. Now multiply that by the hundreds of trucks making that run daily, and you start to see the scale. But transportation is only part of it. The extraction machinery itself is brutally inefficient. A large bucket wheel excavator, the kind retrofitted from timber operations, consumes roughly 500 gallons of diesel per day during active operation. These machines run 6 days a week, 50 weeks a year, and that's 150,000 gallons annually per machine. A mid-sized sand operation might run 5 of these excavators simultaneously. Yet because sand mining wasn't classified as heavy industry in the same way steel or chemical production was, it largely escaped the emissions regulations that came with the Clean Air Act. But the most significant impact might be the least visible. Sand, unlike timber, is not a renewable resource on any human timescale. Trees grow back in decades. Sand accumulates over millennia. The desert deposits being mined today were formed during the last ice age, roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago. Once they're gone, they're gone. The companies that made the pivot from timber to sand understood something fundamental about industrial capitalism. Resources are interchangeable as long as the extraction method scales. It doesn't matter if you're pulling trees from a forest or sand from a desert. What matters is whether you can do it efficiently, legally, and profitably. The machinery is just a tool. The real asset is the system. And that system is still running. Weyerhaeuser, which started as a timber company in 1900, still operates sand divisions today. Georgia Pacific continues to extract sand across the western United States. Sand remains a quiet, steady revenue stream. There's an irony here. The environmental movement of the 1970s forced some reforms on the timber industry. Replanting requirements, endangered species protections, and limits on clear-cutting became standard. But sand mining, which started as timber's successor, largely escaped that scrutiny. It's still governed by mining laws written in the 1870s. The legacy of this industrial pivot is written into the landscape. Drive through Nevada, California, or Arizona, and you'll see the evidence: vast rectangular scars in the desert floor. Abandoned processing facilities slowly being reclaimed by wind and sand. These aren't natural features. They're the footprint of an industry that learned to extract value from emptiness. The same machines that felled the forests now scrape the deserts. The same corporate logic that justified clear-cutting old growth now justifies dredging ancient sand deposits. And the same regulatory gaps that allowed unchecked exploitation of one resource now enable the depletion of another. The trees became lumber. The sand became concrete. Both became profit. And when the next resource runs low, the machines will adapt again, because that's what they were built to do. Extract, process, move on. The resource changes. The system doesn't. That's the real lesson here. Industrial capitalism doesn't run out of things to take. It just finds new things to take them from.